Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and everyone out there in Cyberland. Just want to welcome you to to our talk this afternoon, and also the mics. I think for the people who are here, I think you have to press the button in front of you, and you'll get a little red signal, and that means that you're ready to go. And yeah, okay, so let's talk this afternoon about making meaning of attachment and what does it mean, attachment, and how do we understand it in terms of our work with the families and with kids that we serve, as well as their caregivers, and just understanding how does this relate, how does attachment relate to infant mental health. So I would like to start with introducing you to baby Hugo. Yeah, so who is Hugo with? Any question as to whether or not there is another person on the other side of him? No, he is definitely not alone, and he's definitely in relationship. So that's really what we're going to focus our talk on today, because relationship really is what contributes to infant mental health tremendously. So it is the relationship that means absolutely everything to the emotional regulation and problem-solving development for the young person. And how significant that is. In fact, one of the things that we know from our scientific, community is, two things. Infants need two things in the first 1,000 days, which is in the first 3 years. The first is nutrition, and the second is relationship. So today's talk, we're going to focus on the relationship component part of it. Before I start, I just want to talk a little bit about sort of our just centering myself and centering sort of what helps me understand the work that I do. So whether we're talking about, no matter, regardless of whatever modality that you use out there in your practice or number of treatment modalities, when we're talking about, either the formation of security or we're talking about relational trauma, we're talking about caregivers primarily, right? Infant mental health is really caregiver mental health, because that's the relationship component. So we cannot talk about caregivers in this process, but when we do talk about it, and when we do talk about them, we really have to remember, I mean, I know these things, I know you know them, I just want you to know that I know them to the best of my ability. Let's remember that in our work, judgment is not where this is coming from, and neither is the research around it. It's really coming from a place of understanding, and primarily from the place of hope. Because as we're looking at what might have gone into patterns that are difficult for the young children that we are working with, we're also looking at how to be helpful in those patterns and how to be helpful in shifting some of those patterns. So when we're talking about trauma, and we're also tracking trauma in the relationship, we're also looking at, what has been traumatic or marginalizing or, impacting the caregivers, and that we're looking at that from a position of, historical trauma, community trauma, family trauma, and so on. So that's really important. I also want to, pay special attention to, the relationships in my life, including baby Hugo, who is the newest member of our family, that I've been very privileged to, and I stand here privileged to talk about people that I truly and deeply love, and also having felt truly and deeply loved. So I want to bring that lens to our talk today too. So when we're talking about attachment and security, we've learned some really significant issues around that. We've learned from Bowlby that security and the formation of security is extremely important. We learned from Mary Ainsworth that it's not just, it's also about sensitivity that's important. The caregiver sensitivity to when the child is in distress is extremely important. We've also learned from Dan Siegel that it's not just about being present, but you have to be attuned. So you have to be present and attuned in order to help the infant and understand the infant, relieve distress. And we've also learned from Alan Shore, for example, that right brain affect dysregulation causes or contributes to an understanding of the relationship to be difficult and contributes to relational trauma. So when we're talking about security, security has much to do with the development of regulation and the understanding of relationship as a template in general. So we know that there are about 5 tasks that children need to really master and gain competencies in their childhood. So, and these tasks are very significant for them. So the first is to develop a strong and secure attachment relationship. The second, to learn to modulate external sensory input. In other words, what's going on in the environment and how is this impacting, or how am I relating to what's going on in the environment? And who's helping me make sense of that so that then eventually I can make sense of that myself. Learning to identify internal affective states, both positive and negative. What causes me pleasure and excitement, and what causes me distress? How do I effectively communicate my needs directly as opposed to indirectly? And overall, if I learn to do those things, then I can actually become adaptive and learn how to problem solve, because the world is constantly changing. And because it's constantly changing, we have to know how to be adaptive with it. From what we choose to wear because of the weather to any number of things. So to wake up and be your awesome self and then go to sleep. That's really the task of the little one. And the rest is so much up to the caregiver and caregivers. So brain development, we know, is ongoing. The attachment relationship contributes to that brain development. In fact, we're learning more and more how the attachment relationship, or the relationship, is the architect in some ways in that brain development. The interactive relationship is what's key to minimizing and or eliminating what the infant might experience as toxic stress. So relationship is key to that. So let's look at some fundamental key factors that are guiding our work, particularly in the work of infant mental health, and where does attachment fit into that? So attachment relationship is key to the infant's optimal social and emotional development and cognitive development. Very, very early on, what the infant learns is to answer questions like, is the world safe or is it dangerous? Who is there to protect me? And how do I communicate with them? Infants learn to answer these sorts of questions very early on in the relationship. Infants make meaning about themselves and the world in relationship to others. Care interactions are extremely important, but we also know that they're messy. And we know that interactions don't always go exactly smoothly. Sometimes there's a lot of things that happen in between. Some of the research we have, for example, from Edtronic, is that repair is incredibly and significant to that repair process, to that messy interactions. In other words, it's not that things should go smoothly all the time. In fact, our research tells us that, when we're observing caregivers and their infants, caregivers only get it on the first try about 30% of the time. The other 70% is about efforts to try to get it. So it's in that 70%, in the caregiver's attempts to try to make it better, those are the interactive repairs that are incredibly important and significant. And we also know that babies all over the world, experience their caregivers in the same way when security is formed. In other words, caregivers around the world may have different expectations and may come from different understandings of what it is that their roles are, but felt security, the answers to the questions of who was there to protect me, who was there to keep me safe, and how do I communicate with my caregivers so that when I'm in distress, they know that I need protection, that is very meaningful. Brains are built from the bottom up. Simple circuits and skills provide scaffolding for continued and more advanced circuits and skills to develop. So the goal is self-regulation in order to problem solve. But the process is co-regulation. And that process happens with in the caregiving relationship. Babies aren't born knowing how to self-regulate. They don't really know how to stop impulses. Self-regulation develops incredibly slowly. I just can't stop myself is really significant. I mean, I'm not really sure, but we all know when it's that moment in time when the infant is about 12 months old and suddenly the caregiver goes, no, and suddenly the infant goes from touching it to looking at the caregiver, pausing, and maybe not touching it, right? So that self-regulation or that ability to stop themselves is really important. The part of the brain, the dorsolateral cortex, starts developing at about 12 months and ends in mid-20s. So it is a very slow process. And caregivers help infants to modulate and recover from those internal states. They need the caregiver to help them with that. And that process absolutely impacts learning. The interactive relationship, back and forth interactions between the infant and their caregiver, shape the infant's developing brain and influences, this is so key, and influences interactions between genes and the expression of those genes. The idea of what creates resiliency, and that relationship is behind the promotion of that resiliency. That serve and return interaction. It turns, I can't cope, I am fearful, I can't change what is happening, to, other states. These, this narrative, failure to understand what's going on, and a caregiver who doesn't and can't provide repair becomes a psychic disaster for the infant. And making meaning with the caregiver is how the infant makes connections. And those connections teach the infant who will protect them as they make sense of the world around them, so that we're turning those messy interactions to reparative interactions. And something wrong can change to something right. The infant understands, I can cope, I can have hope. And each repair is important, particularly in that first 12 months. Making meaning of experiences requires that caregiver who helps the infant slowly learn that whatever their feeling states are, eventually get connected to whatever thoughts they develop and to the behaviors that they have. And rather than only seeing or experiencing one of these triangles, what the infant learns, that all of those things together promote the experience. And when the infant is, in that first, those first 1,000 days, the thoughts primarily come from the caregiver. It's the caregiver who is narrating internal states. Oh, you look tired. You must be sleepy. Oh, you don't want that toy anymore. Or you are just not happy with any of this today. Or look at how excited you are. This is making you happy. Or this is making, feel excited about something. So it's the caregiver who narrates that, and the infant eventually understands those experiences for themselves. Toxic stress and the development of self-regulation. Very important factor. Toxic stress is associated with the persistent negative affects on the nervous system, damaging early brain architecture. We know that it negatively influences self-regulation development, resulting in lifelong difficulties. And when we think about toxic stress, well, what is toxic stress? And knowing the difference between a toxic stress event and or experience, because it doesn't have to always be the same thing, and the caregiver promoting positive stress, an opportunity where a little bit of stress can help the infant learn slowly that self-regulation, self-soothing techniques. Infants need an adult to help protect them from stress. If no adult buffers the experience of what's happening, because remember that I can't cope and I don't know what's happening and I can't change it. If that is the experience, if there is no adult that buffers that, toxic stress can result and poses potential difficulties in the diet and in the early days of the relationship. So developmental trauma can occur in context of that caregiving experience in the relationship. This is probably the most significant quote that I've heard that helps me understand what developmental trauma is, and there's a lot of talk about that at the moment. This idea of developmental trauma occurs when emotional pain cannot find a relational home where it can be held. The idea that a caregiver who can buffer stress, the buffering of the stress promotes calm and promotes cortisol levels from continuing to shoot up in the infant. When we think about, stress and stress response, why is this so significant? Because stress, whatever the stress onset is, it produces, a reactivity in the, limbic system, and that limbic system can promote a very difficult response to what is happening. And what infants and children learn eventually is that that kind of immediate response can trigger very fast tracking to recovery and re-engagement. So these fast pathways to recover from stress, which could be fight, flight, or freeze response, those kinds of pathways can be what triggers or what can trigger a stress response that is then unfortunately connected to what a recovery is. In other words, if every single time I have a negative affect and that negative affect causes me to fast track my recovery by eliminating it, avoiding it, or becoming dysregulated by it, then I am finding fast ways to recover from stress. And that fast way, the more experiences I have with that, the more entrenched and the more connected that gets. And we'll think more about that. Versus a slower pathway to recovery, making sense of what's happening, making meaning of what's happening, reflecting on what's happening, and then providing problem analysis. So what's really important is that it's not a negative feeling that causes dysregulation. You can have, and the infant can experience, negative feelings. It's very, very stressful when the person that you're most connected to, who is your protector, right, leaves the room. It's like, what is going on here? I am now in massive, massive distress. But that kind of distress I can experience without it necessarily dysregulating me in a way that causes then my behavior to dysregulate, and so on and so forth. And that this slower pathway to recovery becomes less able to develop in a situation where a caregiver isn't able to provide that kind of opportunity. So the making sense, making meaning, and reflection, that part of the re-engagement, what do I do with myself when I'm in distress, that has less opportunity to develop. And so when we're talking about attachment, we have the caregiver behaviors, and attuned caregiver behaviors understands the child. And that child makes meaning of that caregiving experience, and they, as a result, develop strategies to stay close to that parent, strategies in ways that help them make a security formation. I know what to do when I'm in distress, and I know who to reach out to when I'm in that distress. And also learns in the process calming strategies, and learns to feel understood in that relationship. And that is secure attachment. And we'll talk more about that. We see very complicated relational challenges in our work with young children and their families. We see them across the board. Some of these challenges, where I work in my agency, I hear about them even with youth who come in the door. So they're not unique only to young kids that we see. And part of that, in some ways, is that learning to understand that attachment patterns are not behavior problems, either end, not just for the child or the youth even that comes in the door, or the caregiver, because sometimes we've or maybe it just happens to me, but I sort of scratch my head and think, what is going on? Why is this caregiver acting this way, right? So whatever we're perceiving, whatever the difficulties are, the behavior problems are really, those attachment patterns promote experience problems. And that those experience problems get rooted in the relationship. And sometimes that becomes, it's historical, and it happens, very early on. So whatever, when we're talking about, when we're seeing whoever we're seeing in our practice, the active ingredient is always, always the relationship. So regardless of who we see, whether it's like just, regardless of who we see, what we're thinking about is, what is the relationship component here? What is the meaning of the relationship? How do these relationship patterns develop here? And what does that have to do with, what I'm seeing? Yeah, so let's look at the attachment system, and let's think about together sort of how and what it means. So before we move on, you can't really talk about attachment, I don't think, including, myself, without sort of thinking about, children that you've raised, or children you are raising, or children you are witnessing raising, whatever the situation may have you there, and thinking about sort of even how you might have been raised and how impacted you growing up. So please know, use discretion around how harsh you are on yourself, especially if you've left a 2-year-old this morning at your daycare provider, and they were crying as you left the door yourself, potentially crying or frustrated or whatever have you. So just be mindful of that and be gentle. And if any of this stuff raises, concerns for you, or, something that's lingering and is causing some hangover even into tomorrow, find someone to talk to about it, because it can happen. Okay, so let's think about security and regulation formation. This is a chart that I use because it helps me, understand the pattern developed in the relationship. So whenever I'm, seeing a relationship in front of me, and sometimes it may just, but definitely for the purpose of this talk, a relationship, and it's a young child with his caregiver or her caregiver, or their caregiver. What is the infant experiencing? The infant is connected and completely dependent on caregiving behaviors that are coming from the caregiver. Those caregiving behaviors promote an attachment relationship. In other words, how has this infant learned to stay close to this caregiver? And what does this caregiver do when the infant is in distress? What do their messy interactions look like? How do those messy interactions turn from messy to reparative? What is that attachment relationship generally has something to do with a developed stress response system. What does this infant do when there's an onset of distress, and how do they manage it? And that contributes to social emotional development. So when we're thinking about the caregiving relationship, we know that caregivers who are sensitive, responsive, available, and reparative most of the time, and remember, in those messy interactions, right? Not right the first time. Very important for us to remember, right? That and those caregiving behaviors promote security versus caregiving behaviors that are harsh, punitive, unavailable, frightening, or promote being frightened of the child. And those caregiving behaviors promote secure, insecure, or disorganized attachment patterns. And what do we mean by that? What we mean is we want to look at how has this infant learned to seek proximity with this caregiver when they're in distress? And how does the caregiver reinforce and or encourage their ability to seek autonomy, the infant's ability to seek autonomy away from them when they're not in distress? And eventually, how do they develop shared plans together so that they're communicating, needs and, again, negotiating reparative processes? And what's the stress response system? How is that developing? Is this infant learning how to co-regulate with the caregiver? In other words, when the caregiver shows up, is there a feeling that things are going to get better and eventually learn how to self-soothe, versus the presence of the caregiver actually promotes dysregulation? A co-dysregulation occurs. Caregiver becomes dysregulated, infant becomes dysregulated too. And there's a dance between them that is actually co-dysregulating as opposed to co-regulating together. And things are getting worse. And what does that have to do with social emotional development? What interpersonal development is happening? In other words, what is the infant learning about themselves and others? What are they learning about intrapersonal experiences? Am I worthy of love and affection? Am I worthy of love and affection only when I'm okay and not in distress? Or am I worthy of love, care, and affection across the board, whether I'm in distress or not? And how can communication, and how does that, how do we understand that in terms of the infant's ability for their own sort of self-efficacy and their self-esteem, agency? What am I co-constructing based on my experiences about myself in the world? What do I feel like I can do on my own versus not do on my own? And that is an ongoing process. So infants are born with attachment behaviors. Infants are relationship ready. Hugo, who I introduced you to, is 4 months old. He has already learned the I am glued to you because you are doing something that is really interesting to me. And I am having a reaction to what you're doing. They're unable to relieve their own stress. They remember that I don't know what's happening. I do not know how to make this better. They're hardwired to seek proximity. How do we know that? What does the infant do as soon as it's born? No one has to teach them how to do this. They gasp for that breath of air, and what do generally? They cry. So that cry is a proximity cue. It's like, hey, what, somebody? I need something going on here. Those neural pathways are set with that particular relationship. Attachment exists between the caregiver and the infant, and regardless of the quality, it exists. So there's no such thing as no attachment, because there's always attachment. And infants actually develop different attachment patterns with different caregivers potentially. And not only that, they develop a hierarchy of attachment. Who's on the top of my list, who comes next, and then who comes next. It takes the first year to consolidate my pattern, my template of this attachment figure. So attachment, is really, I really do like to see it and understand it as a stress management relationship model. The parent stays organized as she or he or they organizes and buffers, eliminates the stress for the infant, and provides that recovery. So what's really important is that, as the caregiver stays regulated, they're able to regulate the infant's distress. Attachment security, when a caregiver is available, sensitive, responsive, and provides interactive repair, that caregiver means that they are resonating with the baby. In other words, if the caregiver is interested in playing and suddenly, the baby turns a very sour note to thanks but no thanks, the caregiver changes too. Oh, you don't want to play anymore. Now I need to pick you up and comfort you and soothe you. So that's that interactive repair. The caregiver changes as well as in order to be helpful to what the infant needs. All over the world, caregivers fill different roles. There's many, many reasons that caregivers do what they do. And the parent as protector in the emotional world is what we are looking at when we're talking about attachment. It involves the attachment, the caregiver as a protector, and the child's confidence in that caregiver as their protector. And both components determine the quality of attachment. So it is not just something that belongs to the child. The attachment belongs in the relationship. So if the child had a secure relationship with this caregiver in this time, you don't transplant the child and think, oh yeah, we can easily make this child secure in this relationship. Not necessarily, because it depends on caregiving behaviors. And we'll see that in a minute. The attachment is the emotional relationship between the child and the caregiver. It results in proximity and contact between the parent and the child. It's for the purpose of protection. When the child is in distress, they release a proximity cue. That proximity cue resonates with the caregiver. That caregiver now changes their ability to, whatever's going on with them internally, changes so that they can attend to what that infant needs. That relationship helps the infant know you are my go-to person, and you go-to person, that magic making strange period at whatever it is, 6 months, right? You are different than everyone else in the world. You're different. And when I'm scared or hurt or sick, you're the one I'm looking for. And if I'm playing and a stranger walks in the room, guess what I'm going to do? I'm beelining it to you, because suddenly I'm not happy, I'm not safe anymore, and I'm coming to you. So it helps the child to discriminate between other relationships, and absolutely organizes behaviors of proximity as well as avoidance. So attachment has these classifications, right? Secure attachment, insecure attachment, and disorganized attachment. Secure attachment, infant understands the attachment figure, is available and responsive, and is there when needed most of the time. Insecure attachment, infant doesn't have this understanding in this kind of a way. It's sort of intermittent, or it can be, it can change based on caregiving behaviors. And disorganized attachment is more problematic, because what this category absolutely has told us is that, there's actually a collapse in the proximity seeking behaviors of the infant. In other words, the infant, right, is relationship ready, born relationship ready. The cue they have is to cry to seek proximity. That's behavioral. There's a collapse in that when it's the caregiver who is actually causing fear or causing distress. So there's a collapse in that. I can't come to you when I'm scared because you're the one causing me to be scared. So now what do I do with my proximity? What do I do with this, behavior need that I have that tells me I should come to you? So that takes a lot more difficulties. What we know about secure and insecure attachment patterns is that even though the insecure attachment pattern may not be necessarily secure based, it's still organized. In other words, a child does that over and over again. The disorganized one actually is one that becomes more problematic because an organized one doesn't form. And we can talk about that. So attachment classifications are not diagnostic. This is not what we use to diagnose anybody with. I'm giving them, presenting them to you today because it's part of our talk. But really, what I like to focus on are, what are proximity seeking behaviors? What does the caregiver do with those proximity seeking behaviors? What is the pattern in that? And that's what we're going to get into now. We need to talk about the caregiving system because it is the caregiver who is very much connected to deactivating the child's need for proximity. So when we're talking about, what the caregiver does to help the child feel better when they're activated, like when their need for proximity is up there, that is very significant and important. So what we're really thinking about here is sometimes the caregiver cannot eliminate the distress. So for example, we know that colic is one of those situations where we don't know why that infant cries and cries and cries and cries and cries. It's very, very difficult. We have research and studies that tell us across the globe, the thing that makes caregivers feel the most ineffective is colic. And of course, because we can't stop it, we can't fix it. But we also know that those babies that are being carried around by their caregivers, helping them and buffering that distress still helps them have their cortisol levels lowered in their brain, which is amazing. And when we tell that to caregivers, when we say, actually, you just holding them is really significant and important to them, it is very relieving to caregivers, because how would they know that? I certainly didn't know that. It would have been nice to know. And so what's important is that, the thing that what the infant needs, right? The number one thing is the secure attachment relationship and, with their caregiver. So caregiving behaviors that are gentle and sensitive, promote autonomy from a secure base, provide opportunities to learn. Those caregiving behaviors promote trust in that relationship. And maladaptive behaviors, rejecting the child's or the infant's distress call, being frightened of it, being inconsistent with it, not knowing necessarily what to do, promoting a role reversal, your job is to take care of me, not my job to take care of you, is frightening or intrusive or withdrawn or dissociative or any other one that you probably have come up with, including over promoting attachment cues, which is that sometimes that over-involved caregiver, not allowing for any stress to happen. And again, I just want to remind us that we're not judging why the caregiver has these behaviors. Caregiving behaviors come from a very complex, complicated way. And we have lots and lots of research, and that's a whole other talk. But these caregiving behaviors are dysregulating, and that those behaviors, some of them, particularly atypical, what's called atypical maternal behaviors, frightening, fight-like, aggressive, intrusive, flight, right? Remember that fast pathway we talked about? Well, those can also occur in the interaction between the caregiver and the infant. The infant gets distressed, the caregiver, that's an onset of stress, and then they connect with it in a fight-flight kind of a way, withdrawn and or intrusive kind of a way. And those dysregulating behaviors are very problematic, particularly for that disorganized category. Now, maternal withdrawn behavior, and we're also learning it's not just, it's maternal and paternal, and we're also learning about couple postnatal depression, right? That there's predictors for personality disorder features, antisocial personality issues, and they're independent of child abuse. So let's talk about, what attachment looks like. Attachment is a system that has there's two inverse systems to what we understand attachment. When the child is sick, scared, hurt, or separated, causing fear, right? That child sends a cue of distress. And what that means is that their exploratory behaviors, their behaviors that lead them to be okay and independent, somewhat, as much as they can be, and explore, those behaviors completely shrink, and their attachment-based behaviors are proximity-driven, those behaviors swell. So this is an inverse system because those two patterns, those two behaviors do not exist. They don't coexist. So either the infant is on the bottom, needing proximity from the caregiver with swelled attachment-based behaviors, or they're on the top. So when the caregiver, in their ability to be soothing and comforting and attuned to that proximity cue, what happens is that the caregiver can can deactivate their attachment-based behaviors. And what I mean by that is they soothe those attachment-based behaviors, they're reparative, and exploration kicks in, and attachment-based behaviors shrink. So the infant, right, we know, we've seen it, we've experienced it, the infant who is crying, caregiver says, look at my fancy keys, jingle, jingle, jingle. The infant might be distracted by it for a second and then goes, yeah, I'm not having any of that because I'm not done my crying. Or, the infant gives, signals of, I need you. I mean, what does the infant do? If they're not ready to be put down, if they're not ready to move on and play, how do we know? Do we know? We know. And what that means is that they're still on the bottom of that circle. They're still demonstrating attachment-based proximity-seeking behaviors. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? So secure attachment is when that infant knows what to expect from that caregiver. They know what to expect most of the time, and they know that their attachment-based behaviors are going to be relieved. So babies send a distress signal. That distress signal gets received. Caregiver gives the right response at the right time, whatever that is, right? And tries, that's what that means, tries to help. And the baby understands and trusts that the caregiver is helping them to feel better. So every time the dad recognizes the distress and repairs it, the infant feels understood. And that continues in the template. Strong and secure attachment relationship. I get what I need to do. These are the caregiving experiences, or these are the caregiving behaviors that I experience most of the time, and that provides for me secure attachment. I know how to need you. I know what to do, and I know that if I'm sick or scared or hurt and I have an attachment-based feeling, I know what to do with it and how to do it, and how to get, and that you're going to be responsive to that and be reparative. Not responding to the child's distress means not providing interactive repair. And just to remind us, I'm not talking about on the first try, right? I mean, not doing it. What does that mean? I send a signal, there's my distress. You, caregiver, is inconsistent with my distress signals. Sometimes you're available, sometimes you're not available. Sometimes there's preoccupation around your own needs. Sometimes those needs overwhelm you and your stress, and you're not able to take care of mine and my stress, and comfort doesn't happen. And so what the child learns is, I can't really count on you, caregiver, to provide for me that interactive repair. And now that preoccupation, by the way, from the caregiver, we know can come from any number of really significant reasons, including social determinants of health reasons.
Quick question. What can we do for infants that seem always to be seeking proximity and rarely explore on their own?
I'm just getting there.
Well, there we go. Okay, so it's perfect.
So think about that. If it's still a question, then you'll bring it back. And by the way, no attachment question is ever quick in my experience. So not responding means something that is really important. And what it means behaviorally is that exactly sort of what this question is. What the infant learns is, for some reason, I always need you. So what does that look like? Well, because the caregiving behaviors that I have experienced have been inconsistent, preoccupied, I have a caregiver who doesn't always seem to know when I'm in distress, or my distress really needs to be incredibly, significantly big for them to know. What happens is that what I learn is I need you always. In other words, I am not going to wait until I am on the bottom of the circle and let my attachment-based feelings guide me. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to need you all the time. I am not going to wait until I'm actually needing you, because that's going to be way too late, right? You may be unavailable, you may be preoccupied, you may be, I don't really know what to expect there. So instead, I'm going to start to cue you, even when actually there's nothing in my environment that is telling me that I should cue you. I'm not really feeling, worried about anything except for one thing. I'm worried that I may lose track of you. So that makes me anxious. And that causes my behaviors to look very needy of you. And by the way, I should have said this earlier, and I apologize for not saying this. These are patterns that are consistent and persistent. right? These are not, because, who does not know a 2-year-old who does this? I need you, I need you, I need you, and right now. And then as soon as you go to her, him, or them, they're like, no thanks, I can do it myself. Or now it's too late, please go away, right? So know that these patterns also happen developmentally. These are persistent and consistent patterns. So this infant has learned that waiting for me to really be and have an attachment-based behavior where I am actually feeling that I am in need of my caregiver, maybe it's too anxiety provoking for me. So therefore, I'm going to not only ask for consistent reassurance, but I may not always let you reassure me when it comes. So I'm going to want it and I'm going to resist it. Yes.
So I'm just wondering, when can you start to see that secure attachment has been formed and the parent can then rely on some beginnings of its stages of self-regulation from the child, and they move away from this pattern of constant seeking? Or are you saying that the parent needs to be, or caregiver, sorry, needs to be present all the time, like throughout all of childhood? I'm just wondering when you might start to see the effects of that secure attachment.
Okay, good question. So how do we know the effects of that secure attachment? We know that when the infant is in distress, right? And the caregiver is basically allowing, the caregiver knows that the infant is in distress. Wow, this is really far back. Here we go. I could have just escaped that, but hey. We know that the infant is is cueing distress. And we know that the caregiver now needs to do something with their behaviors to help turn that infant go from, distress behavior to exploratory behaviors again. So exploration means that the infant is no longer experiencing distress. So the infant goes from I'm swelled and I'm crying and I need you and I'm indicating proximity-seeking behaviors, to I am no longer needing that from you because what you've done has helped me go from being hopeless to hopeful. I get it. I now feel better again. I don't really know what that was all about, but whatever you've done, you've helped me to feel better about it. And now I can explore. So now I can move into my environment and be okay again. So for example, right? Infant, cries, caregiver says, I hear you. So voice is really important. I know that I'm coming. I know that you're hungry. I know I'm getting everything ready so that you can feed or whatever is going on. That begins the process of I'm feeling understood by my caregiver. That caregiver comes, relieves, picks up, feeds, distress goes away. Next time, the infant learns, I'm calling out again, I'm hearing my caregiver, begins to sort of form a pattern that they're going to come back. In the meantime, they'd learn how to wait. They might find a finger or two to suck for a couple of seconds before they call out again, right? So, for example, self-soothing behaviors, can become part of this movement away from I'm in full distress to I'm learning how to self-soothe, and I'm waiting for you to make me feel better because I know you will. I know you're on your way. So as the infant gets older, they just go back to being able to be playful. So the caregiver, and we'll see this, the caregiver becomes important to the infant when the infant is in distress because they need that caregiver to go and be connected to. And then once the caregiver says everything is okay and you're going to be okay, that child can move into exploration. And if they're a 9-month-old, it may just mean crawling away and playing with this toy for a minute or two. Does that answer your question? So in the avoidant pattern, we're looking at the child sends distress signals. The caregiver isn't available for understanding what those distress signals are. In fact, they're kind of rejected, not really paid attention to in any way, withdrawn, emotionally unavailable. So the parent might be present, but not in tune or available to relieve the distress. And in fact, there may be a real signal around, I'm not really accepting you when you're in this state. So I'm going to ignore you. It might even be, planned ignoring, whatever it is. And so what the experience is, eventually, with repeated experiences, of course, is I don't know how to need you. And what that looks like is that when I have had, because caregiving, when I have been in distress, and when I've had an attachment-based feeling, I've been scared or sick or hurt, what happens is that there's distance in my relationship to my caregiver. My caregiver becomes rejecting or dismissive or rejecting of me and becomes emotionally unavailable to me. So I don't really know that that's going to be a good method for me to relieve my distress. So rather than focus on my attachment-based feelings with my caregiver, I'm going to learn how to manage them myself. I'm going to learn how to avoid my caregiver, but not just avoid my caregiver. I'm actually learning how to avoid my attachment-based feelings too. So I'm going to lose, sight of what it feels like in my body to go and get help when I'm feeling this way. So this is really significant. We hear a lot of stories of those, 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, mostly 4 and 5-year-olds who are, in classrooms, and the teacher says, please, Mary, before you bite, that, because Shawnette has taken your toy, please go and tell the teacher, come and tell me, I will come and help you. Except Mary doesn't know what it feels like in her body to need help, because I have not learned how to resource a caregiver. So it's really important that this is where it's significant around problem solving. What do you do in a situation like that? You take matters into your own hands. And how do you take matters into your own hands? Well, you can get very bossy. You can tell people what to do. And you can be in control of things as much as you can, because that's what you're learning. That's what you've learned how to do. You've learned how to manage your own distress. So in order rather than go to the caregiver to get help, what you're learning is avoiding the caregiver, and you are actually taking things into your own hands and fixing the problem yourself.
Another question from online. So how would something like this differ with older children who might need some time to cool down on their own before seeking proximity and restoring the relationship?
Yeah, very good question. With older children, again, patterns, right? Look for the signs. Are they actually connected to whatever feelings are going on for them? And their learned pattern, like part of what they're learning, for example, an 8 or a 7 or even a 6-year-old has learned in some way to help themselves. They know some of them actually know pretty well what they need. So they may be able to articulate, I need some time. Or if the caregiver knows that the temperament of this child is that they actually need some time to figure things out, that's different than, not, being, controlling the security by saying, and I want you to do this, and I want you to do that, because in order for you to, and if you do this and you do that, then I don't have to deal with anything. I don't have to deal with stress. So some kids, you learn how to manage that by listening and knowing what their patterns are. Some kids do need some time, and proximity, by the way, doesn't necessarily mean touching. Proximity means resourcing a caregiver. I need to go to my room and have, some sit down time or some quiet time. That's still resourcing a caregiver. That's still being able to be expressive. And as kids get older, those patterns definitely change and definitely shift into something that, the caregiver knows more about. But we know, we can see, I think, caregivers who come to us not necessarily saying this is what my child needs, but knowing this is what my child does all the time that becomes a problem in some way. Attuned caregivers tend to know what it is that their children need, because remember that slide around the caregiver changes with what the child needs? Well, that is attunement, and the child feels felt by that caregiver. When distress occurs in the caregiving relationship, in other words, it's the caregiver who's promoting the difficulty. It's the caregiver who is actually activating the child's attachment-based behaviors. Something I'm doing is causing the distress. That kind of promotion of distress from the caregiver is what collapses that behavioral system. And that child learns that I don't really know how to need you, because here's my dilemma. The dilemma is that I have an attachment-based feeling now. I'm feeling distressed. That distressed feeling is caused by you in some way. And now I don't know what to do, because I should come to you with this distress to feel better. And if I don't come to you, I'm going to continue to feel awful. So these are the patterns where these children, when we see them, in little children, the avoidant child, right? In the strange situation, what does this look like? So the strange situation is the caregiver and the child are in a room together. The infant is playing with some toys. A stranger walks in the room, right? Activates the child's attachment system, like, what's going on? Stranger in the room. And parent, after a minute or so, gets up and walks out of the door, really activating the attachment system. Like, now I'm scared. The secure child goes to the door. The secure child cries at the door. After a couple of minutes, caregiver comes back in the room, picks up the child, and the child basically is like, what just went on there? Like, have you lost your mind? You've never done this before. What's happening? Very quickly, the reparative process happens, and the caregiver is able to soothe the child, and eventually that child goes back to playing with the toys. The avoidant child is upset that the caregiver has left the room, definitely. When we put little caps in to measure their cortisol levels, they're up there. They're like, their body is saying, what's going on? They're not looking at it. They go to the door. They might even whimper at the door. Caregiver comes back in the room. Child turns around and goes back to the toys. Now, the interesting thing is that child isn't actually playing with those toys, because their cortisol levels are still shooting up there. So in other words, they haven't actually returned to exploration. They're still in their attachment part of their behavioral system. Those infants don't demonstrate that they're in distress. So the caregiver actually doesn't know that they're in distress and doesn't even attempt to soothe them, because they've miscued the caregiver. The resistant category, parent leaves, child really gets upset, parent comes back in the room, child gets worse upset. And the caregiver is trying to soothe the child, but the child's not having any of it. It's like, put me down. Parent puts them down, cry even more. So the process of soothing takes much, much longer, and it takes a much, much longer time to move them into a reparative state. The disorganized category has us kind of scratch our heads a bit, because the child can experience all kinds of odd behaviors. They may move towards the caregiver and then walk backwards. They may twirl around as they're walking away. They may fall on the floor and bang their heads. So they have odd behaviors that are telling us this is not a usual kind of a pattern. Sometimes that child can look even secure, depending on what's going on. So those are the classifications, and that's what, you know, sort of helps us understand a little bit about. So for the, you know, the disorganized attachment pattern, what happens is that there's a disorganization. In other words, they haven't found an organized method to help relieve said distress that they're under. And that kind of distress takes not only a much longer time to resolve, but also is very oddly behaviorally demonstrated. By the time the child is 4, which is in that older pattern, what happens is that, you know, it's really important that distress isn't only necessarily derived by, you know, attachment cues, because by the age of 4, what happens is that the child has learned to know that there's another perspective in the room. Developmentally, at a 4-year-old knows that what they want and what their caregiver wants, what's in their mind and what's in the mind of a caregiver could be different. And so developing a shared plan is really important on that top of on the exploration part of the of attachment. In other words, I want to do this, and now you, caregiver, don't want me to do this, to have autonomy, and that's going to cause tension in our relationship. So developing a shared plan is really important. Security is also very much connected now to developing autonomy plans together. This is what you want to do. This is how we're going to get there. You really want to wear your flip-flops today to school, and it's minus 12 outside. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to put the flip-flops in your backpack, or I'm going to leave them right by the door. And as soon as you get home from school, you can put them on and we'll play beach. I don't know. I'm just making that up. But that's the idea of coordination of that plan and understanding of that plan. So shared plan become much more a sense of the attachment system. Proximity is still very, very important, but the negotiation process is also equally important. And this becomes extremely significant when we're looking at older kids, and we'll talk about that in a second. So mapping relationships. When we are having, relational health, when we have attunement in the relationship, we have a relationship that is significant, and it becomes secure, and it becomes a mapping of relationship. And mapping relationships that have adversity promote other sorts of understandings and templates, and that's why, attachment patterns can lead to experience problems and patterns. So, what does this picture tell us about attachment? Nothing. Well, that's not really true. What happens when is this baby exploring at the moment, or is he in distress? Exploring. But in order for us to really look at attachment, in other words, in order for us to really look at attachment-based behaviors, we need to see what the relationship looks like in distress. What does the messy interaction look like? What does the caregiver do to help that infant move from distress, attachment-based behaviors, back to exploratory behaviors. So we need an attachment cue, fear, hurt, in order to assess attachment. And that's why in the strange situation, like I said, the caregiver left. We wanted to, because, you know, we couldn't pinch the child and make them cry. That would be bad. We couldn't make them sick either. That would be really bad. So we scared them instead. And that's how we measured, you know, or that's how we looked at different classifications. So attachment is this very complex equation, an interplay between the baby's confidence and the parent's ability to soothe them, that resulting regulation system that's developed in the baby. What does the baby do when they get distressed? How do they reach out and demonstrate proximity? The dyad's developed patterns, and that helps us sort of understand the secure, insecure, or disorganized. So what you're looking at is, how is this infant cueing their distress, first of all? Are they cueing or are they miscueing their distress? In other words, should this be a situation where this infant should actually be more distressed and they're not demonstrating it? Should this be a situation where not this amount of distress, given, you know, maybe the age of development? And let's talk about blocked care for a second and what we understand by blocked care. Attachment is really, you know, significant, you know, in that first year, you know, when that is that, you know, the formation of, you know, whatever that security formation is developing, and there's a template that's being developed there. So the parent and child are building that relationship together, and the child is learning that template of the relationship as a secure base. In the second year, that template is really significant, because in the second year, the parent and the child are learning how to manage tensions in their relationship. In other words, that's where the parent begins to say, you know, becomes a rule maker or a limit setter or a socializing agent. You know, say please, say thank you, don't touch that, you know, no biting, you know, whatever is happening, right? That promotes tension. I want that, you can't have that. Or I don't want to eat that, you got to have a little bit of that, right? Managing and negotiating tensions is really significant and important. And it's in that first year. If security happens, then the infant learns to trust the intentions of the caregiver. I know, the experience of the infant is, I know, caregiver, that you have me in your state of mind, and you can promote for me that felt feeling of protection. So when you have a behavioral intervention for me, sit out, you know, let's take, you know, 5 minutes to do this or that, or no, you can't have those glasses, I'm putting them away, or you can't have the ball if you're throwing it in the house. Although there's distress that happens, you know, some of that distress happens with a little bit of positive stress. I'm learning something from this. If, however, it's insecure, some of those behavior interventions become more problematic. And so those behavior interventions may not be understood by the child or by the infant. And difficulties occur because the infant doesn't trust the caregiver's intentions. And the child learns to mistrust. If the child learns to mistrust the parent in that first year, there are challenges in that relationship. And what happens is that, you know, blocked care becomes much more a function of their relationship. So what does this mean in terms of adolescence? You know, because certainly my work lately has brought me more into, you know, I'm curious about attachment patterns and what does it say in terms of what we're looking at and measuring in adolescence. Well, what we know in adolescence is that as development continues to occur, what happens is that for sure our young people are much more interested in their own autonomy. They want to be more self-sufficient, and they want to be exploring in the environment much more. And their security or their attachment-based feelings are much less sort of demonstrated to the caregiver. They actually want to solve more of their own problems. So in adolescence, there's a very different component, because even though proximity-seeking behaviors are still significant and important, it's the exploratory behaviors that are much more emphasized. So there's a really different balance that's happening in their relationship. You know, the adolescent is developmentally better able to be self-sufficient. They know they have more resources. Now, whether those resources are, you know, adaptive or maladaptive, that's different, but they're able to look and solve their own problems. So negotiating, they're much more wanting to negotiate really contentious issues, and they want behavioral autonomy. It's really important, and all this is happening, while the parent is still there and available. The caregiver is supporting that process. Yes, I see your need to be more self-sufficient, and they're still needing to exert their influence on the young person. This is still a curfew. This is still an expectation. Oh, I can't tell you that story. Anyway, all of that is happening at a time when, this is very significant and important. And the parent can also be perceived by the young person as in the way of their goals, right? Like, get out of my way. I know where I'm going. And, and peers become way more influential, right? So think about when you have security and you have care that is, I understand that my parent and I understand that what my caregiver has, in their mind for me is, is good for me. Like I understand their intention here. Like I can understand from their mind what they're trying to do. But if you have blocked care and you don't have that, and now you're a young person, it's really difficult to, understand. So some of our findings right now is that if you are that resistant kid, that one that, I don't always know, or I need you all the time, and I'm a little bit more, resistant of your ability to soothe me, as well as I'm not sure about it and I seek it at the same time. When it comes to this pattern, remember, like for these young people, or for the pattern, it's that attachment-based behaviors seem to be swelled a lot, and for this pattern, these young people appear more stressed, more anxious. We see that. They're less likely to return to a negotiation because it promotes more of a negative feeling. And they really sort of struggle to stay in emotionally charged discussions. So for example, in some of our dyads, where, it's very, very difficult for that young person to stay in conversation with the caregiver as they're trying, we're trying as the therapist to try to resolve something, to try to come up with some compromise between the two. And it's not going anywhere, because the more you talk about it, the worse it's getting. Think about the pattern of that, and it might be, connected to an earlier understanding of, what happens in this relationship when there is a, negative feeling that's going on, like when there's tension, what's going on. Maybe that might be something to think about in terms of understanding better. with the avoidant, and studies have been done on resistant and avoidant, trauma a little more, and I think we're getting more of that developmentally, the developmental trauma. But in the avoidant category, these young people, so these are, again, the pattern is I'm much more connected to my, exploratory. I don't do very well going to my caregiver. I never really have. I've learned to deal with things myself. These young people have heightened and unproductive over engagement in arguments that undermine autonomy. So anything that gets in the way of what it is they want to do or how they want to do it becomes really, really difficult to resolve in the relationship with their caregiver, because they really do know the right way. They really do know the best way. They know what's right for them. And how do they know what's right for them? Because they've always known what's right for them. They've always managed their distress in that way. And so these kids have difficulty in relationship with their caregivers to really stay connected to, how do I integrate what you want me to do and what I want to do. So when we think about self-regulation and executive function skills, what does that have to do with learning? Well, we talked about that, fast-paced, stress onset, amygdala, goes through the amygdala that processes negative emotion. The fast activation of relief is, how am I going to get rid of this feeling very quickly? We know that kind of a stress response, is very difficult, and in comparison to a stress response system that actually allows for making sense, making meaning, being reflective, and problem solving. So when you think about, self-regulation, right? What is self-regulation? Well, it is the ability to effectively and efficiently deal with the stressful emotion and then to recover from that emotion. That's what self-regulation is. I know this feeling is intense, and I also know that I need to recover from it. And that, intensity of emotion and feeling and understanding not only happens in the emotion domain, but it also happens in the physical domain. It happens in the behavioral domain, in the prosocial domain, and in the thinking domain. So self-regulation is not self-control. Self-control is that, ability to stop doing something. I can't help myself, remember? Takes into early 20s for that to sort of come together. So it isn't learning about how to control emotion. It's learning how to recover from emotion. And recovering from emotion, when you're an infant, and that attachment relationship helps us to learn how to do that. Not only can I identify a feeling, but in my relationship with my caregiver, I'm learning how to recover from that emotion. And if I'm learning how to recover from that emotion, I'm going to be better able to make meaning and make sense and be reflective of what's going on eventually, and not fast track my distress to immediately, flight, fight. Self-regulation requires executive function skills. So if my emotion domain, if I am not learning how to recover my intense feelings, if my emotion domain hijacks my cognitive domain, I'm sunk. And little kids aren't, these executive function skills aren't available to them. So the caregiver provides all of the executive function skills. And not only the executive function skills, but the methods on how to use them and how to make sense of them, how to make meaning from them. When it comes to relational trauma, It's not a singular event. It permeates the infant's experience. When the caregiver doesn't provide that interactive repair, the infant stays in that negative state for longer and longer. And it's that state, being alone in that state, not having a relational home, that provides the damage to the understanding of the self and others, and impacts, how am I making sense of the world? Relational trauma and brain development, when we think about those two, it leaves that permanent, physiological reactivity in that limbic area of the brain. Onset of stress creates an immediate reaction to that stress, to that negative feeling, and then the recovery of that negative feeling can be fast-tracked. And with time, it just becomes more and more sensitized in that kind of a way.
When an infant is colicky for months and months, and everything the caregiver does is ineffective in soothing the baby, does that impair attachment?
What we know is that for caregivers, caregivers experience this amazing thing in their brain, that when their baby is crying and they do something and their baby stops crying, their dopamine gets, they get a squirt of dopamine in their brain. They go, all right, I love that. I like it. It worked. And then I want to do it again, right? So that squirt of it makes me feel good to do that is efficacy. It's parental efficacy. And it's really significant. So when you have a colicky baby, there ain't no squirts of dopamine happening. Not very many. So unfortunately, if you have a caregiver who, is alone, is isolated, doesn't have a support system, or even an opportunity to say, this baby is driving me, bonkers, I need support, it's going to and could potentially impact the relationship. But it's not the colic that's doing it. So the important thing is that, remember that study I cited, or that some of the research earlier, in that caregivers who continue to hold their babies, even though they look like they're not doing anything to relieve whatever the baby is experiencing, and believe that this, holding that baby, is enough, is really enough to manage, that their buffering of that is what's crucial and important. Those caregivers, still offer an opportunity for that baby to not be stressed and alone. And so, what we're helping, I hope, do with caregivers in the knowledge of that is that we're giving them information about that. I said something to a woman in my spin class. I said to her, she was telling me about her, I hadn't seen her in a while. She told me this, that her baby was colicky and it was really hard. And this is and she was finally, doing some stuff. And I said, I just want to tell you, this is research that tells us la 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 and blah, blah, blah. And then I saw her about, 2 days later, and she said to me that what I said, that little thing, that little piece of information for her changed so much in terms of how she felt about herself when she went home, right? So these are the parts that, because without that information, you could feel like a really bad caregiver, and that could impact your attachment. But if the question is the caregiver's inability to soothe you in your colic affecting attachment, I might want to say not really, because the relationship is buffering you. And that is what we know promotes security. Bring them on.
So the next one, if all babies are born relationship ready, what does this look like for babies with autism?
Very, very good question. Very good question. We're learning a lot more about that, and how autism helps us to understand. babies who are born with autism are still having proximity cues. We know that. We know that those proximity cues that are attended in a way that is attuned promotes security. We know that that is significant and important in terms of the relationship and the template. But how and what the meaning of that is, I think we're learning more about. So the short answer is, we're not really sure. Yeah, but we do know that security is extremely important, even with dyads where the child has autism.
Okay, another one. What about instances where the child is securely attached with one caregiver but not the other?
One of the questions in the adult attachment interview is, which parent were you more attached to, or did you feel safest with, or whatever the question is, but it sort of makes, because it presumes that you're going to have different attachments. That child's behavior may be different with and different doesn't mean better or worse, it just means different based on their security. So that child may be more able to cue directly with the secure attached parent and may cue more indirectly with the other parent. So if I know that this caregiver, when I express a negative feeling, this caregiver is going to reject me, I want to stay close to this caregiver, so I'm not going to demonstrate my negative affect there. This caregiver, I'm happy to express my negative affect with. In fact, I'm going to do it very directly because I know that they can manage it and make me feel, different about it. There's some research that, although I'm not sure, although it might be a good something to look up, is, does it matter? So if mom is at the top of the hierarchy and she's the one that I have my insecure attachment with, what that means is that I have more opportunities with that caregiver to develop insecurity because I have a lot more interactions with this caregiver than I do this caregiver who I have much less interactions with because of, availability of time or something. So that might have something to do with it.
I'll just ask one more and then hold on to some for the end as well.
Sure.
So would a child who's exposed to domestic violence or abuse seek out the abuser? And what would that mean?
I'm sorry, say that again?
If a child is exposed to domestic violence, would they seek out the abuser as an attachment figure?
Violence, witness to violence is one of those categories that promote disorganized attachment, because you have two caregivers, right? Remember, this infant is dependent on caregiving behaviors, right? Infants are born dependent too, right? That's why those caregiving behaviors are so crucial. So you have an infant who's experiencing what's safe in this world? Not much. Who do I go to in order to seek security or safety? Not these two, because they're actually causing fear. So one caregiver is frightening me and the other caregiver is unavailable, or they're both frightening me, or they're both unavailable. So I'm not sure that I would be equal. In fact, what we know is that domestic violence and or intimate partner violence, witnessing of that violence promotes disorganized attachment behaviors. So there's going to be difficulties in those relationships. In fact, one of the more interesting studies, and it was going back to it was more about, looking at relationships that were in dyad relationships, children, like 3-year-olds, I think they were, and their caregivers, moms mostly, all of them were moms, and they were in a shelter. And what the intervention was to go back to, remember we talked about the serve and return interaction, that most of those 3-year-olds had missed crucial serve and return interactions between them and their mother. And so part of their intervention strategy for developing security was to go back to serve and return, which was more about reading books and reading even like baby books where you point to the square and where's the orange one and what does the tiger say, and activities and books that are serve and return, so that security and formation of security could be developed. Oh, I'm going to go on. Okay. No, we'll finish the slide. So, when we're looking at, and so this is partially, I think, where we're talking about. So when we're looking at diets and we're looking at, security and what is it that we're trying to understand better, we have to be able to help caregivers adjust their caregiving behaviors and change their caregiving behaviors, some of them, and that those caregiving behaviors help to understand the child differently. And that those caregiving behaviors then will help the child learn a different strategy to stay close to that caregiver, become more in touch with their negative feeling and attachment-based feelings, and that will promote a change in understanding in the relationship. And that's how we're shifting, attachment. So for kids who have learned, for little infants who have learned to, avoid their caregiver, what we're doing is we're helping that diet and that relationship. We're helping the caregiver be more attuned to attachment-based feelings, whether the child cues them or not. So for example, if a child is playing and falls, we always hope that the child will fall when we're doing this work, because what the caregiver might say is, yeah, but he doesn't need me, but except he should. So if the child falls and we're together, go to the child and make a big deal, because that should be an attachment cue. And I don't mean like, get dramatic. Just attend to it. Oh, you fell. What happened? Oh, look at that. It's red. Oh, that must have hurt. Did it hurt a little bit? That is a caregiver paying attention to what might be and should be an attachment cue. So we want to help kids learn to get now connected to attachment-based feelings. For the child who is overly emphasizing attachment cues, we want that parent to help the child stop and reflect, prioritize, without distance, right? Without distance, without this thing that says, I'm moving away and I'm leaving you, and when you're back and pulled together, then I'll be back and engaged with you. Because that's just going to make this pattern worse. So we want to help caregivers be connected and stay connected while they're helping their child make sense, make meaning, right? Slow pace, slow track problem solving and thinking through tasks and feelings. And for these children, we want to promote security, just safety. And that's why that serve and return interaction is really crucial and important, because there's no expectations. This child has felt psychologically threatened, and therefore, as a result of that, has learned to utilize all kinds of behavioral strategies that are difficult and problematic, coercive even. So, they're not just bossy, they're bossy with aggression. Or they're not just, avoidant, they're avoidant and completely isolated. We want these children to feel safe so that they can let go of some of those psychological controls, those anxious kinds of controls. So security, Attunement is what's important and significant here. So what have we learned about attachment? Well, security is really important. It's important that the parent help the infant and toddler or youth, wherever we get them, to name that emotion, understand that emotion, and learn how to articulate and recover from it. Not control it, recover from it. Self-regulate. Explore significance of comfort, safety, and protection. Develop that self-reflective capacity of others and of self. Information in the environment produces a negative feeling sometimes. Negative feelings are really important. They help guide and understand. They help us understand what's going on in that environment. And it helps to facilitate the transformation of that attachment, understanding. How does it go from I do it all the time for you, we do it together, and then you do it on your own? We have to be able to, recognize that when we have patterns in attachment that haven't gone so well, we're going to have patterns in the relationship that continue to be difficult. And, we're not parent blaming, right? Remember, attachment is two. It's on the understanding of caregiving behaviors and the child's need to stay close to that caregiver. So in that relationship, this pattern has developed. And that when we're looking at the pattern, we're looking at the whole picture and what we do with that. What we do with that information is very important. And we're helping to change the narrative in that relationship. Attachment contributes to brain development systems. And it's so significant that it happens ongoingly. Right to the end.
So what does the research tell us about the impacts of a change in a primary caregiver on a child who has had an attachment, like a healthy attachment relationship during infancy? So, for example, a child being brought into care at birth, placed with a foster family, and then transitioned within a year or so to a kinship care, for say. What could be done to ease those transitions and maintain healthy development?
Yeah, there's some really very important. I mean, I can spend a whole talk on that because that is something that I think about and also talk about using this information. So when we're helping a child, remember attachment, like security is important, right? Because for young children, it's developed in the relationship, right? What the caregiver does is help me understand what to do with my attachment-based feelings and what I do with them. And then when we move them to a different caregiver, they have to learn that all over again. And that's a lot of work, right? So there's a couple of things that come into play there. For example, if the child comes into care and they're a year into a relationship that has not gone so well for them and how they've learned to cue their distress, right? They're brought into another relationship, another caregiving environment, and that caregiving environment may just react to the cues. So you have a child, an infant, who hasn't learned how to cue distress. You have a foster caregiver who isn't really attending to the infant very much because they're not cueing very much. So that, in some ways, continues to promote this relationship. Or you have an infant who's learned, I need to cry, and you have a caregiver who's like, yikes, I got to help this child not cry so much. So I'm going to do some planned ignoring, right, to help that go away. Well, that may not be such a great idea either, right? So what we're doing is we're helping kin and foster caregivers know a little bit about what this child is like when they're in distress. And if we know that this child has developed some ways to express their, attachment-based needs that may need some correcting and shifting, we help to give that information to the new caregiver so that, when Mary comes in and she's really, really quiet, we say to this caregiver, you know what, pick her up and bring her around. Even though she's not crying, attend to her, right? Let her know that you're there. And for this one that cries all the time, pick them up too. Actually hold them until they stop crying entirely, before, know when they can actually move on and be exploring again. So giving caregivers information is really important. When we're moving them from one environment, like a foster care environment, to a potential adoptive home, right? We want to provide opportunities where repair can happen. So what we don't want to do is make it all perfect and the child never cries. We want the child to cry. We want the child to even maybe be sick and throw up a little bit, and have the caregiver, the new caregiver, attend to those cues. Because it's in that repair process, it's in the rupture that causes repair in a secure way that causes security, that promotes security. So we want to be able to give opportunity for this child to learn that this new caregiver is their now go-to person, and that these caregiving behaviors will promote security.
One more. Do you have any suggestions for strategies for helping a parent who might have had an unhealthy attachment as a child develop a healthy attachment with their child?
But one of the ways that we help is to be attuned to what the caregiver is telling us. So, what we want to know, what I always want to know is, what's influenced their growing up? And what's influencing, what have they learned about mothering or fathering? And, what are some of those, what are some of the ways that those strategies, sometimes, caregivers, come, and I've experienced, and they have a very, saturated stories of all the things that have gone awful and horrible. And maybe that is true, absolutely true. And that is their experience of that. But to be able to understand better what that's been like for them. And then from that story have also come some incredible strengths. And what does that tell them about their caregiving, and so on? So there's strategies, some use the adult attachment interview to better understand that and to help the parent know how to resolve those early experiences. Some really great work is happening where parents are actually learning how to they're going into doing DBT skills themselves. So they're learning dialectical behavioral therapy skills to self-regulate, and that will help them then co-regulate. So there's a combination of, I'm learning for myself what I need to do with my stressed feelings, because I have a fast track to my negative feelings. So I'm learning how to make sense, make meaning, problem solve for me, and then I can do it with my kid. So there's a number of different ways to do that. Science is telling us that in the first 12 months, every time the infant cries, it's a distress cue. Every time an infant cries, what it means is I need a reparative process. And remember, I can't do it on my own. So you, caregiver, have to help me move from being hopeless to hopeful. So somewhere in there, if sleep training includes sensitive, attuned, reparative behaviors, and your infant is an infant that has security, and understands that separation and distance can be recovered, that means one thing. And if your infant isn't that and your relationship isn't that, then that means another. And so we can train anything. Well, that's not anything. Training can happen, but not all training is useful and helpful.